The knock on my door was so hard, the glass rattled. Behind me, in my own backyard, 20 years of laughter, music, and celebration filled the warm evening air. My twin sons had just turned 20 years old, and half the neighborhood had gathered to celebrate the two boys nobody believed would ever amount to anything. I wiped icing off my fingers and walked toward the door, a little annoyed at the interruption. I had no idea that on the other side of that door stood a ghost from my past. A man who had once looked me in the eyes and called our newborn sons burden. When I opened that door, I nearly lost my breath. Standing before me was a thin, broken man. His shirt hung off his shoulders like it belonged to someone twice his size. His face was carved with deep lines, and his eyes held a kind of desperation I had never seen on him before. Not even on the worst days of our marriage. "Fatuma," he whispered. "Please, I need help." For one long moment, the music behind me faded into silence. My heart pounded so loud I thought he could hear it. 20 years earlier, this same man had packed a bag, called our sons a mistake, and walked out of our lives without once looking back. Now, here he was, standing on my doorstep, with nowhere else to go. If you have ever been abandoned by someone who was supposed to protect you, if you have ever had to build your entire world from nothing, while the person who left you moved on without a second thought, I want you to stay with me till the very end of this story. Because what happened after I opened that door will show you something about life that very few people ever get to witness. The moment when running away from responsibility finally catches up to the person who ran. This is my story. My name is Fatuma, and this is the story of how strength was born out of heartbreak. The life we built together, before all the pain. There was a simple kind of happiness. I met Yasin when I was working as a receptionist at a small office near industrial area in Nairobi. He worked at a transport company nearby, and most evenings, we would end up at the same little cafe along Mombasa Road, sharing a pot of tea after a long day. He had a way of making heavy days feel lighter. He listened carefully before he spoke, which was rare for a man his age, and he made me laugh even when I didn't feel like laughing. I loved that about him. He, in turn, loved that I never gave up on anything easily. Not even on him, during the small disagreements every young couple has. We dated for 3 years before we got married, and soon after, we moved into a modest rented house in Kilimani. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. In the evenings, we would sit together on our tiny balcony, dreaming about the family we wanted to build. Yasin always said he hoped for boys. I told him I only wished for healthy babies. That was all that truly mattered to me. When I discovered I was pregnant with twins, Yasin was overjoyed. He would place his hand gently on my stomach every night and talk to our unborn sons as though they could already understand him. For those 9 months, I believed we were building the life we had always dreamed about. But dreams, I would soon learn, do not always survive contact with reality. The twins arrived nearly 8 weeks early, at a hospital in Nairobi. They were so small, so fragile, wrapped in wires and tubes that seemed far too big for their tiny bodies. Every single day in that hospital felt like a battle between hope and fear. Yasin stayed by my side during those first frightening days. He would squeeze my hand every time a doctor walked into the room, and he would whisper the same words to me over and over. "They're fighters," he would say. "They'll make it." I believed him, because in that moment, I needed to believe something. Then came the day that changed everything. The news that broke him. The doctor called us into a small, quiet room. I still remember the harsh white light overhead, and the sharp smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. Most of all, I remember the silence right before he spoke. The kind of silence that tells you something difficult is coming even before the words arrive. "Your son survived," the doctor said gently. Relief rushed through my body like warm water. I nearly cried from happiness in that instant. Then he continued. Unfortunately, both children suffered severe damage to their eyesight. My stomach dropped. What does that mean? Yasin asked, his voice suddenly sharp with fear. The doctor lowered his gaze. One child may only be able to perceive shadows and light. The other appears to be completely blind. The room spun around me. I cried until my throat hurt, until I couldn't tell anymore whether the tears were from fear or exhaustion. Fear wrapped itself around my chest like a rope pulled too tight. But that evening, when I held my sons in my arms, for the first time since hearing that news, something stronger pushed through the fear. My son Ahmed curled his tiny fingers around my thumb. My son Burhan slept peacefully against my chest, unaware of the storm that had just begun around him. I kissed both of their foreheads and made myself a silent promise that night. No matter what challenges came, I would never let my sons feel unwanted. I would never let them feel like a burden. I had no idea that promise would soon be tested by the one person who was supposed to make it easy to keep. For several weeks after we brought the twins home, Yasin barely spoke. At first, I told myself he was simply grieving the future he had imagined. The future where our sons would run around the compound, play football with the neighborhood boys, and grow up without any extra difficulty. I told myself this silence was temporary. One evening, with the twins asleep nearby, I found him standing at the sitting room window, staring out into the darkness. "We'll manage," I said softly, moving to stand beside him. He didn't answer. "We'll learn everything they need," I continued. His jaw tightened. "That's easy for you to say," he finally muttered, his voice cold. "What does that mean?" I asked, turning to face him directly. "It means our lives are over," he said. Those words struck harder than any slap could have. I felt something inside me crack. "Our sons are alive," I said, my voice trembling with both anger and heartbreak. "They need us." He looked away, and in that moment, I should have recognized the distance already growing between us. I should have seen the warning signs clearly written across his face. But instead, I kept hoping. I kept believing that the man I had fallen in love with, the one who used to talk to my stomach every night, promising our unborn sons the world, would eventually return. He never did. The morning he left 3 months after the twins came home, Yasin left us. The morning started like any other. Ahmed cried for milk. Burhan needed his medicine. I moved through the house exhausted but determined, the way I had every single day since we came home from the hospital. Then, walking toward the kitchen, I noticed a suitcase sitting near the front door. My heart sank instantly. Yasin emerged from our bedroom carrying a second bag over his shoulder. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He avoided my eyes completely. "I'm leaving." The room fell into a silence so heavy, I could hear my own heartbeat. I stared at him, waiting, hoping for a smile, a joke, some explanation that would make this all make sense. None came. "Leaving where?" I finally asked. "Anywhere," he said flatly. The twins stirred in their bassinets nearby, sensing the tension in the room the way infants often do. I stepped closer to him. "Yasin, stop talking nonsense," I said, my voice cracking. His expression hardened into something I barely recognized. "I want my life back." I felt a coldness settle over me despite the warmth of the morning sun outside. "Our sons are your life." "No," he snapped, his voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "They're a burden." That single word cut straight through me, deeper than anything he had ever said before. "Don't say that," I whispered. "I'm 28 years old, Fatuma," he continued, his voice rising. "I refuse to spend the rest of my life dealing with this." "Dealing with what?" I asked, my chest tightening with anger. "Your own children." He grabbed his keys from the table without answering. "I didn't sign up for this," he said quietly, almost to himself. I stood between him and the door, my whole body shaking. "Please don't do this." For one brief second, I thought he might actually stay. That some small piece of the man I married would win against the fear controlling him. Instead, He gently moved me aside. I can't. The front door closed behind him. Moments later, I heard his car engine start, then fade into the distance down our street in Killimani. That sound, the sound of him driving away, stayed with me for years afterward, playing over and over in my mind during the hardest nights. I rushed outside, carrying Ahmed against my shoulder, just in time to see dust rising from the road as his car disappeared around the corner. That was the last time my sons ever saw their father. Building a life from nothing, the months that followed nearly broke me completely. I worked from home whenever possible, taking on any small job I could find. I sold homemade snacks to neighbors around Killimani. I mended clothes for extra income, sitting up late into the night with a needle and thread while both boys slept beside me. Every single shilling mattered more than I can explain. There were nights I cried quietly after the twins had fallen asleep, worrying about school fees I hadn't yet earned, medical appointments I couldn't yet afford, and a future I couldn't clearly see. Most of all, I worried constantly about what kind of life my sons would have without a father, and without the financial security a two-parent household provides. There were days I skipped meals entirely so the boys could have enough formula. I told myself, again and again, that I simply wasn't hungry. Deep down, I knew the truth. I was stretching every single coin as far as it could possibly go. I remember one particular afternoon, sitting at our small kitchen table, counting loose change with trembling hands. The ceiling fan hummed above me. Traffic noise drifted in from the road outside. No matter how many times I recounted the coins, the total never changed. I buried my face in my hands and cried until I had no tears left. But every single morning, my sons gave me a reason to stand back up and keep going. As the years passed, their personalities began to shine through, brighter than any hardship could dim. Ahmed became thoughtful, patient, and quietly observant of everything around him. Burhan became fearless, curious, and always ready with a joke to lighten the mood. Both boys developed an incredible ability to recognize me by sound alone, long before I even entered a room. "Mum is coming," Ahmed would announce. "She's carrying shopping bags," Burhan would add, almost always correctly. Their accuracy amazed everyone who visited our home. But not everyone who visited treated my sons with kindness. Some people pitied them before they had even properly met them. Others spoke about them as though they weren't standing right there, listening to every word. I remember one woman who visited when the boys were only 5 years old. She lowered her voice, thinking she was being discreet, and asked me, "Who will look after them when they're older?" Ahmed, sitting only a few feet away, turned toward her without hesitation. "I can hear you," he said simply. The woman fell completely silent. That night, I held Ahmed close and told him, "You can do anything you choose to do in this life." He simply smiled up at me and said, "I know, Mum." I realized in that moment that my son already understood something many adults spend their whole lives struggling to learn, that other people's low expectations of you are never a reflection of your true potential. There was another moment, around that same time, that I have never forgotten. A distant relative visited us one Sunday afternoon, and, thinking she was being helpful, brought along a stack of pamphlets about special institutions for children like Ahmed and Burhan. Homes where, she explained gently, they would be properly cared for by people trained for such situations. I remember standing at my own front door, holding those pamphlets in my hand, feeling a mixture of anger and heartbreak I hadn't felt since the morning Yasin left. I thanked her politely for her concern, closed the door, and walked straight to the small dustbin in my kitchen, dropping every single pamphlet inside without a second thought. That night, as I tucked the boys into bed, Burhan asked me quietly, "Mum, why did Auntie bring those papers today?" I sat down on the edge of his bed and took a moment before answering honestly. "Some people believe you need to be somewhere else to be cared for properly," I told him. They don't understand you the way I do. Burhan considered this for a moment, then said something that still brings tears to my eyes whenever I think about it. Maybe they just haven't met us yet. That simple sentence, spoken by a child not even 10 years old, became something of a guiding light for me during the hardest years that followed. Because he was right. Every single person who ever doubted my sons simply hadn't truly met them yet. Hadn't seen the way they lit up a room, the way they solved problems, the way they refused, again and again, to be defined by a single word written on a medical chart. When the boys turned 6, I enrolled them in a school that specifically supported visually impaired learners. I remember the first day terrifying me far more than it seemed to terrify them. The school corridors echoed with the voices of other children. Warm sunlight streamed through wide classroom windows. My palms were sweating as I filled out the enrollment paperwork. Ahmed squeezed my hand gently. "We'll be okay, Mum," he said. Those words should have come from me, the parent, the protector. Instead, it was my 6-year-old son comforting me. I smiled through tears I couldn't quite hide. The boys learned Braille remarkably fast. Within months, they were reading faster than I could keep up with. Our home soon filled with books on every table, their raised dots covering page after page, and their fingers moving across them with astonishing speed and confidence. One evening, I heard Burhan laughing loudly while reading. "What is it?" I asked, curious. "This character reminds me of Ahmed," he said between laughs. "That's only because he's stubborn." Ahmed shot back from across the room. Their laughter filled our small house that evening, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to real peace settle over our little family. But life, as it often does, had one more difficult test waiting for us. A test that would arrive just as my sons stepped into their teenage years. The second storm, the next major challenge, arrived when the boys turned 14. I lost my job after the company I worked for downsized unexpectedly. And one single meeting changed everything for our family all over again. I remember walking home that evening carrying a cardboard box filled with my desk belongings, feeling a fear I hadn't experienced since the morning Yasin walked out the door. That night, rain hammered loudly against our roof. The smell of damp earth drifted in through the open window. My shoulders ached with tension I couldn't seem to release. Ahmed sat quietly beside me on the couch. "Mum, what's wrong?" he asked. I tried to force a smile. "Nothing." He shook his head slowly. "You always say that when something is actually wrong." I laughed despite everything, a small, tired laugh, and finally told them the truth about losing my job. For several long seconds, neither boy said a word. Then Burhan leaned forward. "We'll help," he said firmly. "You are children?" I replied gently. "We're your children?" Ahmed said softly. "That means something." In the years that followed, I started a small catering business, cooking from our own kitchen for events around the neighborhood. Some weeks brought enough orders to keep us comfortable. Other weeks brought almost nothing at all. Bills piled up constantly, and unexpected expenses seemed to appear out of nowhere every single month. In the years that followed, I started a small catering business, cooking from our own kitchen for events around the neighborhood. Some weeks brought enough orders to keep us comfortable. Other weeks brought almost nothing at all. Bills piled up constantly, and unexpected expenses seemed to appear out of nowhere every single month. There was one particular month, when the boys were 16, that I genuinely thought we would have to withdraw them from their extracurricular programs entirely. A large catering order I had been counting on fell through at the last minute, and I sat at our kitchen table late one night, staring at a stack of unpaid invoices, feeling that same old fear from years earlier creeping back into my chest. Without me saying a word about it, Ahmed noticed my silence at dinner the next evening. "You're doing the counting thing again," he said gently. I laughed despite myself, surprised he remembered that old habit of mine from when he was small. The following weekend, both boys quietly organized a small tutoring service for younger students at their school, using the skills they had built over years of studying independently. Within a month, they had earned enough between them to cover their own transport costs and school supplies for the rest of the term, without me ever having to ask. I remember standing in the doorway of their room that evening, watching them count out their own small earnings and split it evenly between household expenses and savings, and feeling an overwhelming mixture of pride and guilt. Pride in who they had become, and guilt that they had ever needed to grow up quite so fast. "You shouldn't have to worry about this," I told them. Byrne simply shrugged. "We're not worried, Mum. We're helping." There's a difference. Yet through all of it, the boys refused to give up. Ahmed threw himself into his studies and excelled far beyond what any of his teachers expected. Burhan discovered a genuine talent for technology, spending hours each week learning new skills using accessible software designed for visually impaired students. At 18, both boys earned admission into university. I cried after reading their acceptance letters. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that every single sacrifice I had made over the years had finally, truly mattered. The tiny, fragile premature babies that doctors had once worried so much about had grown into remarkable, capable young men. When their 20th birthday approached, I decided we would celebrate properly, the way we deserved to after everything we had overcome together. We transformed our backyard with string lights and colorful decorations. Friends, relatives, old teachers, and neighbors all came to join the celebration. The air carried the delicious smell of grilled meat and freshly baked cake. Music drifted through the warm evening, and golden bulbs glowed softly above our heads. For hours, I simply stood back and watched my sons move through the crowd. Ahmed stood confidently, discussing his university studies with a group of relatives. Burhan entertained a circle of guests with stories and jokes, making everyone around him laugh freely. Neither of them looked broken. Neither of them looked limited in any way. They looked exactly like what they truly were: strong, capable, deeply loved young men who had built themselves into something extraordinary. And then, in the middle of all that joy, came the knock at the door. The ghost returns. When I opened that door and saw Yasin standing there, anger arrived in my chest before shock even had a chance to settle in. 20 years seemed to vanish in an instant. I remembered the hospital corridors. I remembered the unpaid bills stacked on our kitchen table. I remembered crying myself to sleep more nights than I could count. Meanwhile, the man standing in front of me stared down at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. "Can I come inside?" he asked quietly. I almost said no. Something in me, years of hurt, maybe, nearly slammed that door shut right then. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table in silence. Outside, the party continued, laughter and music drifting in through the open windows, while old ghosts seemed to fill every corner of that quiet kitchen. Yasin looked far smaller than I remembered him. His hands trembled slightly as he finally spoke. "My wife left me," he said. I folded my arms across my chest. "What wife?" "My second wife," he answered. The words barely surprised me at all. He continued speaking slowly at first, then faster, as though the truth had been building up inside him for years, desperate to finally escape. After leaving us, his business had flourished for a while. He had bought a larger house, purchased several vehicles, and traveled frequently, spending money as freely as he pleased. Then, gradually, things began to fall apart. Bad investments failed one after another. Business partners disappeared with what remained of his savings. Debts accumulated faster than he could manage them. His second wife, seeing the collapse coming, drained their remaining bank accounts and left before the worst of it hit. Soon afterward, the bank repossessed the house he had once been so proud of. "I sleep in my car most nights now," he admitted quietly, his voice breaking. I studied his face carefully in the dim kitchen light. The confident young man who had once walked out on his newborn sons no longer existed in front of me. Only the consequences of his choices remained. "Why are you here?" I asked directly, his eyes filled with tears. "Had nowhere else to go," he said. That answer should have satisfied me completely. Yet something about it still felt incomplete, like there was a piece missing from the story he was telling. I leaned forward slightly. "That isn't the whole truth," I said. He looked away again, and for several long moments, he said nothing at all. Then another piece of the truth finally emerged. "I followed the boys online," he admitted. My chest tightened instantly. "What?" "I found their university achievements posted somewhere. I saw photographs from different events over the years," he said, his voice shaking. I realized everything I had believed for 20 years was wrong. The room fell into a heavier silence than before. For 2 full decades, this man had convinced himself that blindness guaranteed failure, that our son's condition meant a lifetime of hardship with no real future. Now, undeniable evidence stood directly in front of him, proving otherwise. Our sons had succeeded completely without him. That single revelation changed everything about why he was really sitting at my kitchen table that night. He had not come back because he suddenly loved us again. He had come back because reality had finally, forcefully destroyed the lie he had carried with him for 20 long years. That truth hurt far more than I expected it to. The conversation that changed everything. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, Ahmed and Burhan were laughing together with their guests, their white canes resting against a garden chair nearby, completely unaware of who was sitting in our kitchen at that very moment. For years, I had imagined this exact reunion playing out in my mind, over and over. Sometimes I imagined shouting at him. Sometimes I imagined turning him away without a single word. Instead, standing there that night, I simply felt tired. Deeply, completely tired. When I turned back around, Yasin looked genuinely terrified. "Please," he whispered. "I'll help you," I said finally. Relief flooded across his face instantly. Then I continued, my voice firm. "On one condition." His fragile smile disappeared immediately. "You will explain to your sons exactly why you left them," I said clearly. He shook his head immediately. "I can't." "Then neither can I replied, standing my ground completely. Fear flashed across his eyes. "I don't know what to say to them," he admitted. I let out a bitter laugh. 20 years gave you plenty of time to think of something." He buried his face in his trembling hands. "I can't look at them," he whispered. Before I could respond to that, another voice interrupted us from the doorway. "You'll have to." Yasin froze completely. Ahmed stood in the doorway, calm and composed. Burhan stood beside him, equally still. Neither of them looked angry in the way I expected. That calmness frightened me far more than shouting ever could have. My sons had heard everything. Their canes tapped softly against the kitchen floor as they walked in together, the sound echoing gently through the room. Yasin stared at them in complete silence. His own sons, the children he had abandoned as newborns, now standing before him as grown, accomplished young men. Ahmed spoke first, his voice steady. "We've waited 20 years for this conversation." Burhan nodded beside him. "We're ready to hear the truth. All of it." For a long, heavy moment, nobody in that kitchen moved. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, the party music continued playing softly, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding inside. Finally, Yasin began to speak, his voice cracking repeatedly as the words came out. He admitted his fear from all those years ago. He admitted his selfishness. He admitted that he had chosen his own comfort over his responsibility as a father. Most importantly, after 20 years of silence, he finally admitted, out loud, that he had been completely wrong. When he finished speaking, a different kind of silence followed. One that felt lighter than the heaviness that had filled the room only moments before. Ahmed took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking again. You didn't leave because we were blind, he said calmly. Yasin frowned, confused. What do you mean? You left because you were weak, Ahmed said simply. The words landed heavily across the room. Nobody argued with them. Because, deep down, everybody sitting in that kitchen already knew they were true. What we chose to build after that night, Yasin stayed with us briefly. I gave him a warm meal. I gave him a small room to sleep in. I treated him with basic human dignity, because that is simply who I am. Regardless of everything he had put us through. But I could not give him back the 20 years he had thrown away so carelessly. Some losses, I have come to understand, remain permanent no matter how much time passes, or how many apologies follow. The boys chose to meet with him occasionally in the weeks and months that followed. They listened to what he had to say. They asked him difficult questions. And ultimately, they decided their own boundaries with him, at their own pace. I never once pressured them either way. That choice belonged entirely to them, and to no one else. Watching my sons navigate that complicated situation taught me something important that I carry with me to this day. Strength does not appear when life is easy and comfortable. Strength appears precisely when life hands you every possible excuse to give up, and you choose to continue moving forward anyway. For years, I had believed I was the one raising two vulnerable children who needed constant protection from the world. The truth, I eventually realized, was very different. Those two boys raised parts of me as well, in ways I never expected. They taught me resilience I didn't know I had. They taught me patience during the most exhausting years of my life. And they taught me a quiet, unshakable kind of courage that no hardship could ever fully take away. Meanwhile, Yasin's story taught me, and hopefully anyone listening to this today, a different, harder lesson entirely. Running away from responsibility may feel easier in the moment it happens. But time has a way of quietly collecting every debt left unpaid. Eventually, every single person faces the true consequences of choices they made long ago, whether they are ready to face them or not. When I look at Ahmed and Burhan today, two confident, capable young men standing on the edge of bright futures they built almost entirely on their own, I no longer think about everything they lost the day their father walked out that door. I think, instead, about everything they built despite that loss. The lesson we carry forward, their blindness never defined who my sons became. Their character did, and perhaps that is one of life's greatest, most important tests, when hardship arrives, and it always eventually does, for every single one of us. Do we allow it to shrink us down into something smaller? Or do we use it as fuel to become something far stronger than we ever imagined possible? If you are watching this today, and you are carrying the weight of someone who abandoned you, someone who called you a burden, someone who walked away when you needed them most, I want you to remember Fatuma's story, and I want you to remember her sons. The people who leave us during our hardest moments are not always villains punished by some dramatic, sudden twist of fate. Sometimes, they simply spend years running from a truth they are too afraid to face. Until life, in its own quiet, patient way, forces that truth back into their hands. And the people who stay, who fight through impossible mornings and endless sleepless nights, who keep showing up for the people who depend on them, those are the ones who end up building something truly unbreakable, brick by brick, year after year, without ever needing applause for doing it. So if today, life has handed you something difficult, something that feels unfair or impossible to carry, remember this. You are not being punished. You are being shaped. And one day, much like Fatuma and her sons, you may look back and realize that the very thing you feared would destroy you was actually the thing that built you into someone unstoppable. I think often about that word Yasin used the morning he left. Burden. For 20 years, that single word hung over our family, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake, even on our best days. But watching my sons grow into the men they are today, I have come to understand something that took me far too long: to fully accept a burden is not a person. A burden is a belief that someone chooses to carry, or chooses to put down. Yasin carried that belief for 20 years, and it cost him everything: his sons, his peace of mind, and ultimately, the family he could have had. Ahmed and Burhan, on the other hand, never once carried that word as their own. They simply refused to let someone else's fear become their identity. That, I believe, is the real difference between the people who break under hardship and the people who rise above it. It was never about what happened to them. It was always about what they chose to do with what happened to them. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If Fatuma's journey moved you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that quiet strength deserves to be celebrated just as loudly as any dramatic victory, stay with us, because there are many more stories like this one, still waiting to be told. This story is inspired by real experiences shared by our viewers. To protect everyone's privacy, certain names, locations, and details may have been changed, while the heart of the story remains true.